From Halifax, here is Tom Clark.
Hello and welcome to Halifax for this special roadshow edition of the West Block. I'm Tom Clark. While we're here aboard the HMCS St. John's in Halifax Harbor, this is a tool of Canadian security, and security is what everybody's talking about here in Halifax at the Halifax International Security Forum put on by the Canadian government. Senior government officials and security experts from more than 50 countries are gathered here. So what are they talking about in the hallways? Well, here is your weekly West Block primer and security briefing. The security briefing starts in Syria, where civil war continues to escalate as the total death toll marches towards 40,000, and the violence is expanding to Turkey. What's next? In Israel last week, after days of escalating Palestinian rocket attacks, the Israeli military launched the heaviest offensive against Gaza in 4 years, saying it's just the beginning. But the beginning of what? Closer to home, with the discovery of new sources of oil and gas, is the U.S. about to become energy independent? And what does it mean for the Middle East and Alberta's oil sands? Well, one of the fixtures at the forum for the past number of years is Senator John McCain of Arizona. 4 years ago, of course, he ran for the presidency of the United States. He lost, but he remains a very influential voice in Washington. I sat down to talk with him earlier in this conference, and among other things, he has called for open parliamentary hearings on the proposed takeover of Nexen by the Chinese National Oil Company. But we started with the key issue of Israel. Here's part of that interview. Senator McCain, good to have you back on the program again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I want to start with the most pressing issue of the day, and that is what's happening in Israel and the rapidly deteriorating situation that we see in the Middle East. What should the Western response be to what's happening now?
Well, obviously, first, the Western response should be do everything we can to prevent an escalation. This could, I hope not, but it could escalate into something that is more serious than perhaps many years, because we're not sure how Egypt's going to behave in this whole scenario. Always before in these kind of conflicts and exchanges between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, that the Egyptians had always been kind of a leavening influence. I hope they will continue to do that, but and they're in kind of a tough position. Morsi has his constituency and his base, so I hope that we can get enough Western influence in there on both sides to bring this back down. But right now, Hamas has crossed a couple of red lines, attacking Tel Aviv, now Jerusalem, and the Israelis may feel that they have no choice but to go in on the ground. And finally, though, the last couple of times there's been incursions by the Israelis, either Gaza or, in one case, Lebanon, hadn't turned out well. So I think that the Israelis are rather reluctant, but they can't just sit there and watch incoming rockets. Thank God for Iron Dome.
Late last week, David Petraeus testified behind closed doors to 2 congressional committees about Benghazi and what actually happened there. He says, according to reports out of those committees, that there's no question that the CIA determined that this was a terrorist attack. He also said that the CIA talking points were then redacted to take that out, redacted by whom we don't know. What do you make of this unraveling? Is there a sort of conspiracy going on to keep the truth from the American people?
This has turned into one of these classic Washington scandals, a centipede that a shoe drops every day or two. There are more questions than answers, and there are more questions than there was at the beginning of this. I don't know the answer. I do know that there are certain obvious facts. People don't come to spontaneous demonstrations with mortars and heavy weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The people who were in the consulate were taken out to Germany the next day. They could have been asked if this was a spontaneous demonstration or not. In fact, we know now there was no demonstration.
Why do you think the president or the administration would have redacted those documents to take out the reference to terrorism?
You can surmise that the President of the United States in the campaign was saying, we got bin Laden, Al-Qaeda's on the run, we have prevailed in the war on terror. He said that time after time after time. Well, this being a terrorist attack kind of poked a big hole in that narrative.
I want to, because we've touched on this and talked about David Petraeus, I want to ask you a little bit about his personal situation. Do you think that David Petraeus should have resigned as the head of the CIA?
I think that's a decision that only David Petraeus can make, but I do believe that I hope and pray that there will be additional ways that David Petraeus can serve the nation and the world. I believe he's the finest military leader that I've ever encountered, a combination of leadership and intellect, and I grieve for him, but the decision had to be made by David Petraeus.
The current political mood in Washington following this election campaign, is there enough goodwill in Washington, on the Hill and in the administration, to come to some sort of a deal to avoid the worst of the fiscal cliff?
First of all, I don't think there's a lot of goodwill because of the nature of this campaign. It's probably the worst in many ways campaigns that I've ever observed, and I've observed a lot of them.
What was bad about it, Senator?
Well, calling, running these hundreds of millions of dollars in attack ads on Romney. He may have been guilty of the death of someone. He may have been a felon. The things that were said about him, in my view, were something that I would never do in a political campaign. You might recall that I was urged during the 2008 campaign to go after President Obama, then Senator Obama, about the Reverend Right and things in his background, and I refused to do that. They had even ads basically alleging that Mitt Romney was responsible for someone's death. So, and of course, all the outside money and the negative ads, and there was negative ads on the Republican side too. So there's not a lot of goodwill, but there is a realization that the American people expect us to act to prevent a cataclysmic event, which is this fiscal cliff. And I believe that we will reach an agreement. I believe we must reach an agreement. I think the markets are already telling us that they expect an agreement because it would plunge us into another recession.
And of course, you've got all your allies, Canada among them, who are saying, get on with the job, because we're going to be sideswiped. If you go down, we go down too.
Sure, and already the European economy, as you know, is sinking back, and the Chinese economy is in some difficulties. So if you throw the fiscal cliff in there, we could look at a worldwide recession that the likes of which we have not seen in many years.
Senator, there's one issue that I want to get your thoughts on, and it's a big debate in Canada, but it affects the United States as well. And I'm talking about the proposed takeover of a company called Nexen, which is a player in the oil sands in Alberta, by the Chinese National Oil Company, a state-owned enterprise. What is your sense, what is your view, rather, of a Chinese state-owned enterprise having a stake in what would be obviously very strategic reserves in our economy?
I think that's a judgment that the Canadian government has to make, but let me say that the Canadian economy is strong, is good, is much better than the United States, and yet it is a smaller economy, obviously. So I think the government has to take in consideration how big an impact and how big a role this company would play in the Canadian economy. I think that's a judgment that only the elected leaders can make. One thing that I think might be helpful, to me even, would be some hearings in Parliament as to exactly what this means and exactly the impact that it would have.
Senator McCain, great having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.